Hello and welcome to the Flickering Torch, and on today's episode, does game system matter? Oh. Now this whole video was sparked from reading a tweet by Capri's House of Gaming. This is the tweet here. And I think I fundamentally disagree with it. Now this isn't a hit piece or me throwing shade or trying to start drama with another YouTuber. Capri's House of Games has got some really cool stuff on there. You should definitely go check out his stuff, and I'll leave a link in the description. So I think I just disagree with the thesis statement at the top of the tweet here, that system doesn't matter and will never matter. I think I fundamentally disagree with this. I talked about this specifically on the Pod of Many Things. I feel like I'm plugging a lot of different things today, but I spoke about this on my episode in the Pod of Many Things. And I think system really does matter. It's another tool to put in your GM's toolbox, and it's a really important one. And I've got three main points here I want to make about why I think system matters. My number one point on why system matters is it changes your expectations. Most people have played 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and they've been playing it for years. And with them playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and if they've especially not been playing with you, they're going to have certain expectations for what that game needs to be, what that game provides, what that game is. And it's usually quite a high-powered fantasy, kind of comedic romp, because the D20 system obviously is quite swingy. So our heroic heroes can trip on flagstones and miss their hits, and it's all about kind of a super light-hearted fantasy adventure. That's not to say you won't have drama elements in there. That's not to say a good GM can't turn it to other things. But I'm using 5th edition here as my baseline. So if we talked about the expectations that 5th edition sets up, let's talk about the expectations of another game. So I'm going to use here Night's Black Agents. Now, if players are entirely new to Night's Black Agents, the expectations are what they get from the book. And what they get from the book is, this is an action thriller. Like the blockbusters you've been watching all of your life, you are essentially Jason Bourne. The expectations they then have are, this is fairly serious, it's going to be dramatic, and it's going to be high-octane thriller. And it's also going to involve investigative elements and sort of conspiracies. And I think by just bringing the system to the table, you, without even saying to the players, this is what we're going to do, have already set an expectation just by bringing the system to the table. So that's kind of my first point here. If you bring 5th edition to the table, you have certain expectations. If you bring other games to the table, either the players are going to have no expectations, or they're going to have kind of the expectations of that game. Another great example here is Blades in the Dark. The expectation is very clear in the book. You're playing in sort of Victorian-esque city and you're playing as gang members, and the whole feel of the game is setting up and planning heists. That's the expectation of the players. And yeah, you can run heists in 5th edition. You can run great heists in 5th edition. But the expectations, they're not set specifically on a heist, or this is a spy thriller, or this is a horror game. First reason system matters is it builds player expectation. Okay, but now then, why do we have different fantasy systems? The point I'm going to make here is it creates emphasis. And emphasis is so important. So let's have two different examples here. In 5th edition, we're travelling several miles over a mountain to get to a village. In Forbidden Lands, we're travelling several miles overland over a mountain to get to a village. Those two journeys, mechanically just based on the system, are going to be vastly different. Now, why is this? The designers have put certain mechanics into these games to emphasize certain aspects, and Forbidden Lands wants you to think about survival. So you just going a place can be a session. You can have situations where you run out of food, you run out of water, you run out of torches. And it's not just, oh, I've ticked off 5 torches, I'm out of torches. No, there's mechanics in the game to make sure you run out. The example is obviously the resource dice. I've talked about this before. You're rolling a d12, so you don't actually know how many resources you have when you set out on a journey. You don't really know day to day what you're going to end up with resource-wise. But let's have a look at the same thing in 5th edition. What can you do in 5th edition? I can buy as much food and water in rations as I need for that day. And I can literally estimate it out throughout the whole journey. So a character in 5th edition, mechanically, because of the system, is never going to run out of food and water unless they're poor at planning. This just doesn't happen in a system like Forbidden Lands, where our resources are kind of vague and obscured from us. Just that one piece of gameplay, you and your party travelling from one place to another, because you've changed systems, suddenly has so many more dangers. You can run out of food, you can run out of water, you can fail to make camp for the night. This is just something that 5th edition as it is, as the rule is, as the systems are, doesn't allow for. Look at the difference in emphasis between these two fantasy systems. If you get in a fight in 5th edition, you basically, unless you're using spell slots or your special abilities, aren't any really worse for wear, character-wise, after that fight than you were before it. Sure, you've taken hit point damage, but all of your bonuses, all of your modifiers are the same. So, fights are something you want to engage with. It's a combat-focused game. You're wanting to get into those fights, because there's no real detriment to doing that. It's not going to stop you unlocking the door 3 doors down. And that's what the game's built around. That's what a lot of the focus and the mechanics are for. And that's why it's so fun to have those fights in 5th edition. We look at those fights in Forbidden Lands. Every time you take damage, you're taking damage to your attributes, so your character's getting worse. If you get in a fight in Forbidden Lands, you instantly know, I'm gonna have trouble after this. Even if you win that fight easily, and you only take 1 or 2 points of damage, you've taken 1 or 2 points of damage directly to your strength. It's not only this, you can push yourself to damage yourself outside of combat that's going to make your combat harder. So a bunch of these factors, because of the system, have changed a combat in one game from a combat in another game. And this emphasis is really important for building plot elements around. If you know your characters are going to get more and more haggard, you can build that into your stories and your encounters and make it so the players have more options to avoid combat, because combat isn't the focus of this specific system. Also, your players are going to interact with your game differently because they know how dangerous combat is. They're less likely to get into combat because combat will leave them worse for wear. Whereas in 5th edition, I think players are quite likely to get themselves into combat, or at least not try and actively avoid it. The final point I'd like to make is mechanics aid story. And I want to preface this by saying, of course, any GM can run any kind of story in any system, and any good GM, as long as they know what makes that system and that kind of story work, can make any of those games good. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is system does matter, because those games can be better in a different system. So here I want to talk about story being directly affected from mechanics and system. Okay, so you're playing in Call of Cthulhu, and your sanity meter is dropping and dropping and dropping, and because of that mechanic, you're more likely to fear the kind of things that sit in the dark. And again, I know the Dungeon Master's Guide does have rules for insanity, but they're optional rules. You're changing the system to add those in, right? So in Rules as Read regular 5th edition, sanity doesn't exist. You could be fighting Mind Flayers and Gibbering Mouthers all day, and your adventure isn't any less or more shaken. And that's a good thing for that game, because the game is about fantasy combat, and that's kind of what people are really enjoying about the system, and that's great. But in Call of Cthulhu, it's not about fantasy combat. It's about hiding from those monsters, running from those monsters, trying to stop them. And because it has this system of insanity, it's so much easier to build those stories, because your characters have kind of like a health bar of their own sanity, of their own fear, and that system helps the story along. It aids the story, because then you can build things around the idea of losing insanity, or give them possible hope to find more sanity. And that kind of mechanic definitely impacts directly with the story. And also we can see this in the A Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game, because you're not playing a player character, you're playing a house. And why that is really, really important is in Game of Thrones, characters die, and we're sad when characters die, but we realise the story continues. And also Game of Thrones, you're supposed to have this kind of allegiance to your house that comes above pretty much anything else. 5e, if your character dies, that's kind of the end of their story mechanic-wise. So you won't have, unless specifically a player is targeting that, they won't necessarily want to build up the house. They won't want to invest the resources in it. They won't want to send off their character to get married to another character overseas to strengthen an alliance. And that, I think, is another reason why mechanics and story really mesh well together. And that is another reason I think system does matter, and system has always mattered to not only the role-playing game or the players, but the whole story you're telling. And again, thank you to Capri's House of Gaming for the tweet that kind of inspired this video. Anyway, that's all from me this week. Be sure to catch Blades in the Dark Red Herrings on Monday nights at 7:30 on twitch.tv/theflickeringtorch, or catch the VOD here on YouTube. The first episode is out and Jordan is doing an excellent job GMing for us all, even though like a bunch of us don't really know the system. He's really coaxing out the best parts of it to show us. Also, follow my new Twitter account. Right, that's all from me. See you next week, and happy gaming.